The bitter cold cut through everything. Vasily Petrov stood on the frozen rubble of what used to be a factory, his breath forming small clouds in the December air. Around him, the city of Stalingrad was dying, block by block, building by building. The Germans had been hammering them for months, and every day felt like the last day anyone would see the sun rise over the Volga River again. It was December 1942, and the battle had become something beyond human comprehension. Soldiers froze to death in their trenches. Others starved. The lucky ones died quickly from gunfire. Vasily was 23 years old, but his face looked weathered by decades. His eyes carried the weight of men who had already died 1,000 times over before their actual final moment came. He adjusted his Mosin rifle, a weapon so old it had fought in the Russo-Japanese War. The gun was reliable, yes, but reliable wasn't enough anymore. Not here. Not against what they faced. "Petrov," a voice called from behind him. It was Sergeant Alexei Volkov, his superior officer. The man's face was gaunt, hollow. Most commanders were the same now. "You're taking the eastern perimeter tonight. Keep watch for any movement from the German positions." Vasily nodded without speaking. There was nothing to say. Every night was the same. Every night brought the possibility that it would be your last. He had already watched 23 men in his unit get picked off by German snipers. 23. Each one a face he remembered. Each one a reminder that his rifle, as dependable as it was, simply couldn't match the precision and power of the German weapons across the frozen wasteland. The Germans had Kar-98K rifles. Some of them had scoped versions, upgraded models that could reach out and touch you from distances where your weapon was useless. They had MP-40 submachine guns. They had MG-42 machine guns that fired so fast they sounded like cloth tearing. And here Vasily stood with a rifle designed before the Great War, modified here and there, but fundamentally the same gun his grandfather might have carried. "Do you think we'll hold?" a younger soldier named Dmitri asked. The kid couldn't have been more than 19. His hands shook constantly now, whether from cold or fear, nobody could tell anymore. Vasily looked at him for a long moment. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell this boy that they would survive this, that reinforcements were coming, that the winter would break the German offensive, that somehow they would pull through. But Vasily had stopped lying weeks ago. It took too much energy. "I don't know," he said finally, "but we hold until we can't anymore." The night descended like a black curtain. Stalingrad became a world of shadows and silence, broken only by distant explosions and the occasional crack of rifle fire. Vasily moved through the ruins to his assigned position, a third-floor window of a partially destroyed building that gave him a view of the German lines nearly 800 meters away. He settled into place, positioning his rifle on a makeshift rest made from broken concrete and a wooden plank. Through his scope, a simple 3.5x magnification that was better than nothing but far inferior to what the Germans carried, he scanned the white landscape. Somewhere out there, German snipers were doing the same thing. Waiting. Hunting. At 0430, movement. A figure in grey-white camouflage moved across the frozen rubble. German. Vasily followed him with his scope, calculating wind, distance, elevation. He had been trained well, and he had survived this long for a reason. His finger found the trigger. The shot echoed across Stalingrad, and the figure fell. 1. That was 1. But there would be 10 more tomorrow, 100 more this week. The mathematics of attrition were brutal, and they always favored the side with better equipment. "Good shot," Dmitri's voice came through the darkness. The young soldier was positioned 2 meters away, serving as spotter. "Not good enough," Vasily replied, and he meant it. Not good enough because his rifle had limitations that no amount of skill could overcome. Not good enough because out there, somewhere in the German positions, was a sniper with a better weapon, better optics, better everything. And eventually, that sniper would find him. That was how this game worked. The hours crawled forward. 4:37, 5:12, 6:03. Each minute felt stretched, pulled apart like taffy. Vasily remained motionless, his eye pressed against the scope, his finger resting beside the trigger guard. He had learned years ago that patience was a sniper's greatest weapon, more important than the rifle itself, more important than strength or luck. patience, and the acceptance that death was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The only question was when. Petrov. Sergeant Volkov's voice crackled through the frozen air. He had moved to their position during the night watch. Command wants a status report. How many confirmed? 4, Vasily answered. Maybe 5. Hard to be certain in this light. Volkov crouched beside him, peering out at the German positions through binoculars. The sergeant's jaw clenched as he surveyed the landscape. He knew what Vasily knew. They were equipped with inferior weapons, fighting a war where the Germans held every advantage except numbers. And numbers in modern warfare meant nothing if you couldn't protect them with proper firepower. We're getting reports of German preparations for a new assault, Volkov said quietly. They're massing resources. They want to push through and reach the river. If they do, this sector collapses, and we lose the southern district entirely. Vasily processed this information without reaction. It was bad news, but bad news was constant now. Endless. How long until they attack? Maybe 2 days, maybe 3. Command doesn't have good intelligence. Volkov paused, then added, We need every skilled marksman we have, which means keeping you alive becomes a priority. That was something, at least. Being useful meant they might allocate resources to keep you alive a little longer. It meant hot food sometimes, it meant better ammunition. Small things. But in Stalingrad, small things were everything. The dawn came grey and reluctant, as if the sun itself was tired of shining on this nightmare. Vasily remained in position as the light improved, scanning the German lines continuously. He took 3 more shots as targets presented themselves. 1 confirmed kill, 1 probable, 1 miss, the bullet whistling past close enough to make the German soldier throw himself into the snow. You're getting frustrated, Dmitri observed. I'm getting outgunned, Vasily corrected. The distinction mattered. Frustration was a luxury. Recognition of tactical reality was survival. My rifle can do what I ask of it, but what I'm asking isn't enough anymore. By 7:40 hours, his position became compromised. A German sniper had located him, and a shot came through the window, missing by centimeters. Too close, too organized. Vasily and Dmitri withdrew, moving through the frozen rubble back toward the Soviet lines. That night, Vasily sat in a makeshift shelter, a basement beneath the ruined factory, and he faced a terrible truth. His skill was considerable. His courage was proven. But skill and courage meant nothing when your enemy possessed superior weapons, and you did not. Something had to change. Something had to be different. Or soldiers like him would simply become casualties, statistics in a war of attrition that the Soviets could not possibly win. He didn't know it yet, but that change was coming. It would find him in the darkness, offered by someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. But for now, all Vasily Petrov could do was clean his rifle and wait for tomorrow's horrors. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. And if you want to know what happens next, make sure you're subscribed, because this story gets darker before it gets better. The cold had become a living thing by mid-December. It wasn't just temperature anymore. It was a presence that occupied space in Vasily's chest, in his lungs, in the very core of his being. 3 days had passed since his position was compromised. 3 days of moving through the rubble, avoiding German patrols, watching men die for territory that had no strategic value beyond the fact that someone had decided it mattered. The assault Sergeant Volkov had predicted came on the 15th. The Germans threw everything they had at the Soviet positions: tanks, infantry, artillery barrages that turned the city into an inferno. Vasily fired his rifle until his fingers went numb, until the barrel became too hot to touch safely. He killed 5 Germans that day, maybe 6. The noise and chaos made it impossible to be certain. When the dust settled and the Germans withdrew to regroup, Vasily discovered he was one of only 4 men from his original squad still alive. 4 out of 32. The mathematics were final. At this rate of attrition, he had perhaps 2 weeks before his luck evaporated entirely. That night, as he moved through the basement shelters with what remained of his unit, a hand grabbed his arm. Vasily's survival instinct kicked in immediately. He spun, rifle raised, only to find himself facing a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was older, perhaps 40, with mechanical grease under his fingernails, and the bearing of someone who had actually worked before the war, before everything became about survival. "Don't kill me," the man said in Russian, but with an accent. Ukrainian, maybe, or Belarusian. "My name is Mikhail Sokolov. I was a gunsmith before all this, before the war. I know who you are. Everyone knows who you are. The sniper who gets kills when nobody else can." Vasily didn't lower his rifle. "How do you know me?" "Because I move through these shelters too. I see things. I fix things. And I've watched you come back day after day with confirmed kills, using a rifle that shouldn't be able to do half of what you're doing with it." Mikhail paused, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "But you're frustrated, I can see it, because your rifle has limitations, and you've hit those limitations." "What do you want?" Vasily asked. "To help you, to give you something the Germans won't expect, something that could change things." Mikhail's eyes were intense, focused. "Not for you, for all of us, because if you die, we all die a little bit sooner. The Germans know this. They fear you because you're the closest thing we have to a weapon that matches theirs, and they want you dead." Vasily lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it ready. "I'm listening." "Not here. Come with me. There's a place deeper in the shelters, a workshop. We need to talk without ears nearby." The basement workshop was hidden beneath 3 levels of rubble and concrete. Mikhail had somehow maintained a space where the temperature was almost bearable, where tools hung organized on walls despite the chaos above. It was impossible, yet it existed. In Stalingrad, impossible had become the only thing left that was possible. "What was your job before the war?" Mikhail asked as he lit a small stove that provided minimal heat and almost no smoke. "Cavalry officer. Then transferred to infantry. Then they wanted marksmen. So now I'm a sniper." Vasily didn't see the point in lying. "And you?" "Gunsmith, premium weapons, rifles for hunters, for competitions." I understood the mechanics of precision, how small changes in design could mean the difference between a miss and a kill. Mikhail pulled out his Mosin Nagant rifle, similar to Vasily's but different in subtle ways. The Mosin is a good rifle, reliable, accurate enough for most purposes, but we're not dealing with most purposes anymore. "What are you suggesting?" Vasily asked, though part of him already knew. "A modification, not just one, several, things that are technically forbidden by Soviet military regulations, things that could get both of us executed if discovered." Mikhail laid the rifle on a workbench. "But they would also make your weapons significantly more effective." "How much more effective?" "Enough to match a German Kar 98K with optics. Maybe exceed it. Better trigger mechanism. Reinforced components. A modified bolt design that increases velocity. Better sighting system. I can fabricate most of what we need from scrap metal. I've been collecting materials for months, waiting for someone worth risking everything for." Vasily studied Mikhail's face. The man wasn't proposing this casually. This was something he had thought about, planned for, waited for. The question wasn't whether Mikhail could do it. The question was whether Vasily was willing to accept the consequences. "If we're caught, they'll shoot us," Vasily said. "Yes, if we're caught, but if we're not caught, and if this works, you'll become something unprecedented, a Soviet sniper with a weapon that performs beyond Soviet military specifications. And maybe, just maybe, that changes the trajectory of this battle. Maybe that saves lives." Mikhail's voice grew quieter. "They're not going to feed us much longer. They're not going to hold this city. Everyone knows it. The war is already lost. We're just delaying the inevitable. But while we delay, people die, people like your friends. People like those 4 men you had left from your original squad. What if you could prevent some of those deaths? And what if the modification fails? What if I take it into combat and my rifle jams? What if it explodes in my hands? Then you die. Probably. But Vasily, you're going to die anyway. We all are. The difference is that this death might have meaning. This death might slow down the German advance, might give people time to do something, anything different." Mikhail looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm not going to force you, but I am asking you to consider it. Really consider it. Not the fear, not the regulations. Consider what it could mean if you had a weapon worthy of your skill." The silence stretched between them. Outside the workshop, Stalingrad continued its death throes. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Gunfire crackled sporadically. Men screamed. The city was a living organism in its final stages of death. "How long would it take?" Vasily asked finally. "To do it properly?" 4 days minimum. More if I need to fabricate components that don't exist yet. We'd have to work in shifts. You'd need to keep your regular duties, keep appearing in your usual positions so nobody suspects anything. And you'd have to keep your mouth absolutely closed. Not a word to anyone. Not Sergeant Volkov. Not Dmitri. Nobody. And if someone finds out, then we're both dead. Court-martialed and executed for violating direct military regulations on weapon modification. They'll make examples of us. Mikhail picked up the rifle again. So the real question is, are you willing to die for something that might not even work? For something that exists only in the theoretical space between hope and delusion? Vasily thought of the 5 men he had shot that day. He thought of the 4 soldiers left from his original unit. He thought of the thousands of men dying around him, most of them with rifles that couldn't match German weapons. He thought of Dmitri's hands shaking from fear and cold. "When do we start?" he asked. Mikhail's expression shifted. A small smile appeared, quickly suppressed. "Tomorrow night. Bring your rifle, bring extra ammunition, and bring the understanding that there's no going back from this. Once we start, we're committed." Over the following 4 days, Vasily lived a double life. By day, he maintained his duties as a sniper. He took positions, fired his rifle, reported kills to Sergeant Volkov. The Germans seemed satisfied that he was still operating within expected parameters. By night, he descended into Mikhail's workshop and watched as the gunsmith transformed his weapon into something that shouldn't exist. The work was meticulous. Mikhail had him clean every component, understand every modification. The trigger was adjusted for a faster, cleaner break. The bolt was modified to increase velocity. New sights were fabricated from scrap materials, improving accuracy significantly. Each change was small, but together they accumulated into something revolutionary. "This is dangerous," Mikhail would say as he worked. "Not just the modifications, the process itself. If a Soviet officer inspects your rifle during this transformation, if they notice it's not in its standard configuration, they'll know immediately." But Vasily didn't hesitate. He had made his choice. He had stepped across the line into forbidden territory, and there was no retreat now, only forward. Only the hope that when he finally took this weapon into combat, it would perform the way Mikhail promised. Only the hope that this risk, this violation of regulations, this betrayal of military specifications, would mean something beyond just postponing his own death a few weeks longer. On the 4th night, Mikhail handed him the modified rifle. "It's done," the gunsmith said. "Your weapon now is something unique, something powerful, and something that will get us both executed if anyone discovers what we've done." Vasily held the rifle, feeling the slight differences in weight and balance. In the dim light of the workshop, he couldn't see much difference from the outside. But inside, everything had changed. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me after this weapon saves your life, or thank me on the way to the firing squad. One or the other seems inevitable at this point." Mikhail looked exhausted. The work had taken something from him. "Take it into combat tomorrow. See what it can do. But Vasily, you need to understand something. This weapon is only as good as the hands holding it. The modifications matter, but your skill matters more. This gun doesn't make you invincible. It just gives you what you should have had all along. Equality, a fighting chance." Vasily climbed back through the shelters toward the upper levels, the modified rifle in his hands. Tomorrow he would discover whether Mikhail's work had been worth the risk. Tomorrow he would finally know whether forbidden things could change the course of history, or whether they were simply elaborate ways to delay the inevitable. The modified rifle felt different the moment Vasily touched it in the pale dawn light. It wasn't dramatic. There were no visible signs of what Mikhail had done beneath the surface. To any observer, it would look exactly like every other Mosin Nagant in Soviet hands. But Vasily could feel it. The slight difference in trigger response. The imperceptible shift in weight distribution. The weapon had become something more than it was before. December 19th arrived with a German offensive that caught everyone unprepared. They came from the northwest in force, pushing hard against the Soviet defensive lines. Sergeant Volkov positioned Vasily on the fourth floor of a partially collapsed administrative building, a location that provided clear sight lines across the frozen wasteland toward the German assembly areas. Dmitri accompanied him as spotter, the young soldier's hands still shaking from cold and perpetual fear. "Stay sharp," Volkov said, before leaving them to their position. "Command thinks this push is meant to break our lines and reach the Volga. If they succeed, we lose this entire sector." Vasily nodded without responding. He was already settling into the familiar ritual of preparing for a shooting match. He positioned the rifle carefully, finding the exact angle that would give him maximum coverage of the approach routes. He cleared the scope, checked his ammunition, verified the modified mechanism was operating smoothly. Everything felt precise, intentional, different from before, though he couldn't have explained exactly how to someone who didn't know about the modifications. The Germans began their assault at 0730 hours. Artillery shells screamed overhead, impacting the frozen ground with tremendous force. The concussions were so powerful that Vasily and Dmitri had to grip their position to avoid being thrown backward. Dust and snow swirled through the ruined building, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Then the infantry appeared, wave after wave of grey uniforms advancing across the white landscape. Vasily waited until the snow cleared slightly before taking his first shot with the modified weapon. The trigger broke clean. The rifle recoiled with familiar force. Through the scope, he watched a German soldier in the third rank drop without warning. "Target down," Dmitri confirmed. "Approximately 750 meters, northwest sector." Vasily was already loading the next round. The modified bolt moved smoother than it ever had. The action felt almost liquid compared to the standard mechanism. He fired again. Another German fell, then another. The fire discipline was perfect. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, purposeful. "Vasily, they're adapting," Dmitri said. The Germans had noticed the incoming fire and were spreading out, taking cover positions, attempting to locate his position. Getting scattered now. But the modified rifle's improved sighting system allowed Vasily to track individual targets through the chaos. He fired at a German officer attempting to coordinate a flanking maneuver. The officer crumpled. He fired at a machine gunner setting up a position near the frozen rubble. The machine gunner collapsed. He fired at a soldier carrying ammunition boxes. That soldier fell as well. By 0800 hours, German casualties in his sector had reached 23 confirmed. The wave of assault infantry began to break, falling back toward their starting positions. The German command structure had adapted to his presence faster than usual, which meant his original position was compromised. Standard procedure would be to withdraw, relocate, prepare for the next phase of the battle. But Vasily had one more idea. With Dmitri's help, he moved the rifle to a secondary position 15 meters away while maintaining visual contact with the original spot. The Germans, anticipating his withdrawal, concentrated their counter-sniper fire on the empty position. Through his scope, Vasily watched German snipers reveal themselves as they attempted to eliminate the threat they assumed still existed there. He took shots at those snipers, quick, decisive actions. One German sniper in camouflage fell, then another. He was identifying and eliminating the very weapons that had hunted him for months. The irony wasn't lost on him, though there was no time to contemplate it. By 0900 hours, the German offensive in his sector had been effectively halted. They pulled back, regrouped, and seemed to decide that pushing harder against this particular position would result in unacceptable casualties. The battle shifted eastward, where other Soviet positions were crumbling under pressure. When Sergeant Volkov returned to their position, his expression changed the moment he saw Vasily. "What happened here?" "Command received reports of massive German casualties in this sector. 47 confirmed kills attributed to sniper fire. 47. That's not possible." "The angles were favorable," Vasily replied carefully. The visibility improved at the crucial moment. The Germans made themselves available. Volkov studied him with new intensity. The sergeant had been a soldier long enough to understand when something fundamental had shifted. He didn't ask questions about Vasily's sudden improvement. To do so would invite answers that neither of them wanted to have. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "Well, keep doing whatever you're doing. Because if you can continue at this rate, We might actually have a chance to hold this position. Word traveled quickly through the Soviet ranks. A sniper who had single-handedly stopped a German assault, a marksman whose accuracy had shifted the outcome of a battle. Within hours, soldiers from other units were approaching Vasily with questions. How had he improved so dramatically? What was different about his technique? Could he teach them? Vasily revealed nothing, but he noticed Mikhail appearing in the shelters, moving through the ranks, listening to conversations. The gunsmith was assessing possibilities. He was considering how his knowledge might be applied to other weapons, other shooters. The modifications that had been designed specifically for Vasily's rifle might be reproducible for others, if materials could be found. Over the following 3 days, modified rifles began appearing among other skilled marksmen. Mikhail had found 2 other gunsmiths who understood the work. They had begun producing modifications in secret workshops scattered throughout the frozen city. The process was slow, dangerous, absolutely forbidden by Soviet military regulations. But the results were undeniable. German casualties in Stalingrad spiked in a way that no one could have predicted. Snipers with superior weaponry began exacting a price that the German command structure hadn't anticipated. The momentum of the battle shifted, not dramatically but noticeably. The impossible was occurring. Soviet weapons were beginning to match German capabilities. On December 22nd, Vasily took a position overlooking a German ammunition depot that had been identified by reconnaissance. Through his modified scope, he watched German soldiers moving supplies. He could have taken shots. He could have inflicted casualties. Instead, he simply observed and reported the location to command. The depot was bombed that night. Soviet aircraft destroyed months of German supplies. The attack wouldn't change the ultimate outcome of the battle. Stalingrad was still lost. The Germans still controlled most of the city. But for the first time in weeks, Soviet soldiers began to believe that they weren't completely helpless. They began to believe that determination and innovation could partially compensate for inferior numbers and resources. Vasily's modified rifle had become something more than a weapon. It had become a symbol. The symbol that when you were pressed to the absolute limit of survival, when everything was taken from you, when you had nothing left but desperation and skill, sometimes that was enough. Not enough to win, but enough to fight. Enough to matter. Enough to make your death mean something beyond just another casualty in an endless war of attrition. The inspection came without warning. December 28th. Colonel Petrov, no relation despite the shared surname, arrived at the forward positions with a team of military police. He was conducting a routine weapons audit, checking to ensure that Soviet soldiers were maintaining their equipment according to specifications. It was the kind of inspection that normally meant nothing. Weapons were cleaned, verified, logged, and the inspection would move on to the next unit. Vasily's rifle was selected randomly, or perhaps not randomly. Perhaps someone had reported suspicious activity. Perhaps word had reached the command structure about the modifications spreading through the ranks. The exact mechanism didn't matter. What mattered was that Colonel Petrov held the modified Mosin Nagant in his hands and immediately understood that something was drastically wrong with it. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he examined the weapon. He rotated it, studied the mechanism, and his jaw tightened. "This rifle is not in regulation configuration," he said quietly. "This is a modified weapon. Explain yourself." Vasily stood at attention, his mind racing through possibilities. Denial was pointless. The modifications were obvious to anyone who understood weapons. Mikhail was certainly compromised as well. The game was finished. The only question now was whether they would be shot for unauthorized weapon modification or whether there was something he could say that would matter. "Yes, sir," Vasily replied. "The weapon was modified to improve accuracy and reliability." "By whom? And under what authority?" "By myself, sir. Using materials scavenged from damaged equipment. No authority. It was unauthorized." The colonel's expression suggested he had expected this answer. He looked at the rifle again, then at Vasily, then at the surrounding soldiers who were watching the exchange with barely concealed tension. Unauthorized weapon modification was a capital offense. Court-martial, conviction, execution. It was as simple and final as that. "And how many kills have you achieved with this unauthorized weapon?" the colonel asked. 186 confirmed in the last 2 weeks, sir." The number hung in the frozen air between them. The colonel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to one of his subordinates and said, "Check the casualty reports. What are the numbers on German losses versus Soviet losses in this sector over the past 2 weeks?" The subordinate consulted papers and replied, "German casualties have spiked to approximately 340 men, sir. Soviet casualties are half that. It's one of the few sectors where we're actually gaining ground in terms of casualty ratio." "And this correlates with when the sniper fire increased in accuracy and volume?" the colonel asked. "Yes, sir. The spike began December 15th, when sniper effectiveness in this sector increased dramatically." Colonel Petrov examined the modified rifle again. He worked the bolt action, feeling the smoothness of Mikhail's modifications. He looked at the sighting system and understood immediately that it was superior to standard Soviet specifications. He handed the weapon back to Vasily and took a step closer. "You understand that what you've done is a direct violation of Soviet military regulations," he said. "The penalties for unauthorized weapon modification are severe. They extend beyond execution to include implications for your entire family." "Yes, sir, I understand," Vasily replied. He was beyond fear now. The confrontation had arrived, and survival was beyond his control. "But you also understand that your modifications have resulted in a tactical advantage that we desperately need." The colonel paused, studying Vasily's face. 186 confirmed kills, that's not a margin. That's a statement. That's a man with a weapon that finally matches his skill. "Yes, sir." "Who else has been involved in this modification process?" the colonel demanded. Vasily considered lying, considered protecting Mikhail and the other gunsmiths, but the colonel's expression suggested that lying would only make things worse. "There are others, sir. A gunsmith named Mikhail Sokolov, 2 other men whose names I don't know. They've been modifying rifles for other marksmen." "How many modified rifles are currently in operation?" "I don't know the exact number, sir, but I estimate at least 15, maybe 20. The colonel nodded slowly. He looked toward the German positions, then back at Vasily. "Send word that I want to meet with this Mikhail Sokolov. Tell him to bring samples of his work. And tell him he shouldn't run or hide, because if he does, the consequences will be significantly worse than if he cooperates." Over the next 2 days, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of arresting Mikhail and the other gunsmiths, Colonel Petrov convened a meeting that included Soviet command staff, weapons experts, and military engineers. He presented the modified rifles as examples of Soviet innovation under pressure. He presented the casualty ratios. He presented the tactical results. The decision came down from higher command with surprising speed. The modifications would be formally analyzed. If they met certain specifications and could be produced reliably, they would be incorporated into Soviet military standard procedures. The men who had performed the modifications would face no punishment. In fact, they would receive recognition for their contribution to improving Soviet combat effectiveness. Mikhail was assigned to a weapons development program, working with official capacity to refine the modifications and make them reproducible on a larger scale. Other gunsmiths were brought into the program. Within weeks, modified Mosin nagants began appearing in production runs, no longer forbidden but officially sanctioned. On January 3, 1943, Vasily was called before Sergeant Volkov. The sergeant was smiling, which was unusual. Volkov produced a document and read from it. "By order of Soviet command, you are hereby recognized for exceptional service in combat. Your actions have resulted in significantly improved casualty ratios and have contributed tactical advantages to Soviet forces. Furthermore, the weapon modifications you developed have been approved for official military use. You are promoted to senior marksman with corresponding pay increase and rations." Vasily listened without reaction, but internally something shifted. He had crossed the boundary into forbidden territory. He had violated regulations, risked execution, made himself vulnerable to court-martial, and instead of punishment, he had received recognition. The forbidden had become the official. The dangerous had become the policy. That evening, Vasily met with Mikhail in what was no longer a secret workshop, but an official Soviet military facility. The gunsmith was examining new rifles, making refinements to the modification process. "So you're famous now," Mikhail said without looking up. "Other units want to know your secret. Command is requesting more modified weapons than we can possibly produce. They want to scale this up. Are you satisfied?" Vasily asked. "Satisfied? I don't know. I took a terrible risk for something that might have gotten us both executed. Instead, it might change the course of the war, not dramatically. The Germans are still going to advance. But maybe, if enough soldiers have weapons that match what they're carrying, maybe we last a little longer. Maybe we save some lives." Mikhail finally looked at Vasily. "And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough." Outside, Stalingrad continued to burn. The Germans continued to push. The battle would eventually be lost, and then it would be won, and then it would matter, and then it would be forgotten, like all the other battles before and after. But in this moment, in this basement workshop that had become an official military facility, two men had achieved something that shouldn't have been possible. They had proven that innovation, born from desperation and necessity, could occasionally overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The war continued. That was the brutal truth that persisted, even as Vasily Petrov's modified rifle became legend. Stalingrad fell to Soviet forces in February 1943, but the cost was staggering. Nearly 2 million men dead, wounded, or missing. The Germans withdrew, but they withdrew to new defensive positions. The war would grind on for 2 more years, consuming millions more lives before it finally ended in Soviet victory and German defeat. But something had changed in those frozen months in Stalingrad, something fundamental about how the Soviets approached warfare. The modifications that Mikhail Sokolov had developed didn't win the war. They couldn't do that. No single innovation, no single weapon could overcome the massive strategic and logistical advantages that the Soviets possessed by 1943. But they proved something important. They proved that when ordinary men were pressed against impossible odds, when everything was taken from them except their skill and their determination, sometimes innovation could emerge. Sometimes forbidden things could become official policy. Sometimes desperation could birth genius. By March 1943, modified Mosin nagants were being produced in Soviet factories, not as secret modifications anymore, but as official variants. The Mosin Nagant model 1891 30PU became standard equipment for Soviet marksmen. The modifications that had been developed in underground workshops, while under threat of execution, were now being manufactured by the hundreds, then the thousands. German command noticed. They attempted to replicate the modifications. They attempted to understand how Soviet weapons had suddenly improved so dramatically. Mikhail Sokolov was promoted to captain and placed in charge of Soviet small arms development. He worked through the war years, designing and refining weapons, always pushing toward better performance. When the war ended in 1945, he continued his work in the Soviet military-industrial complex, eventually becoming one of the most important figures in Soviet weapons design. He never became famous in the way that field commanders became famous. He never had his face on propaganda posters, but his innovations influenced Soviet weapons development for decades. His fingerprints were on the Mosin variants that equipped Soviet forces through the rest of the war. His ideas influenced later designs. His legacy persisted long after he was dead. Vasily Petrov survived the war. He took his modified rifle through Kursk, through the liberation of Ukraine, through the final assault on Berlin. He survived when so many others didn't. But survival came with a cost. His left eye was damaged by shell fragments in 1944. His left arm developed a tremor that never fully disappeared. His mental state, fractured by years of violence and killing, never truly healed. After the war ended, he struggled to return to civilian life. The transformation from a sniper who had killed hundreds to a man trying to exist in peacetime proved impossible. He worked as a weapons instructor, teaching new generations of Soviet marksmen. He taught them the discipline of precision, the patience required for long-range shooting, the mental discipline necessary to remain calm under fire. He never spoke about the modification process. That part of his history was classified, kept secret by Soviet command. But his students knew he was something exceptional. They could see it in his technique, in the way he understood weapons, in the way he understood war. Dmitri, The young spotter who had served with Vasily throughout the battle was killed in 1944 during a German counter-offensive. He was 22 years old. Vasily didn't learn of his death until weeks after it had occurred. He never recovered from that particular loss. In some fundamental way, Dmitri represented everything that Vasily had been fighting to protect. A young life cut short, potential unrealized, another casualty in a war that consumed everyone eventually. The spread of modified rifles through Soviet forces continued throughout 1943 and 1944. Soviet snipers equipped with superior weapons began exacting a price that German command hadn't anticipated. Casualties mounted. German confidence eroded. By 1944, the Germans were in full retreat, and Soviet forces were advancing across Eastern Europe toward Berlin. The modified rifles didn't win the war. The sheer weight of Soviet numbers, Soviet resources, and German overextension won the war. But the modifications contributed. They gave Soviet marksmen the tools to match their opponents. They transformed desperation into capability. The historical record rarely mentions Vasily Petrov. He doesn't appear in major histories of the Second World War. His name doesn't appear in Soviet propaganda materials. The modifications he pioneered are footnotes in larger narratives about Soviet weapons development. But within the Soviet military establishment, his influence was significant. The principle that innovation could emerge from desperation, that forbidden things could become official policy if the results justified it, became embedded in Soviet military culture. When the Soviets faced challenges during the Cold War, when they needed to develop weapons systems that matched Western capabilities, they remembered Stalingrad. They remembered a sniper with a modified rifle who had changed the trajectory of a battle through sheer determination and innovation. Mikhail Sokolov lived until 1967. He died in Moscow, recognized as a significant figure in Soviet weapons development, but never at the level of the famous generals or the high political figures. His work contributed to Soviet military superiority in multiple domains. The principles he established influenced everything from small arms to artillery pieces. His legacy was technical, subtle, but profound. In 1993, 50 years after the events in Stalingrad, some of the classified files were finally declassified. Military historians began to understand what had actually occurred. They understood that the improvement in Soviet sniper capability hadn't been miraculous or mysterious. It had been the result of deliberate innovation by men like Mikhail Sokolov and Vasily Petrov, men who had violated regulations, risked execution, and transformed their desperation into something that actually mattered. The lesson of Stalingrad, the real lesson that went beyond the propaganda and the official histories, was simple. When you were backed against the wall, when everything was taken from you, when survival was impossible and surrender was unacceptable, sometimes you had to innovate. Sometimes you had to do forbidden things. Sometimes the only way forward was to break the rules that were supposed to constrain you. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very skilled, that breaking of rules resulted not in execution, but in recognition. It resulted not in punishment, but in transformation. It resulted not in your destruction, but in your legacy. Vasily Petrov died in 1979. He was 60 years old. He had survived the war by 16 years. He spent those years teaching, refining his craft, passing on knowledge to younger marksmen. He never gave interviews. He never wrote memoirs. He never publicly discussed his role in the modification process. But his students knew. They understood that they were learning from someone who had achieved something exceptional. They understood that precision, patience, and innovation could occasionally overcome overwhelming odds. The modified Mosin Nagant rifles remained in service with Soviet forces for decades. They were eventually replaced by more modern weapons systems. But the principles that Mikhail had established, the innovations that had been born from desperation in the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, those principles persisted. They influenced Soviet weapons development through the Cold War. They influenced how the Soviets approached engineering challenges. They proved that sometimes, when the stakes were ultimate, when survival itself was uncertain, ordinary men could achieve extraordinary things through the combination of skill, determination, and willingness to challenge authority. The story of Vasily Petrov and Mikhail Sokolov is not typically remembered as a turning point in the Second World War. Historians usually emphasize larger factors. But for those who were there, for the men who carried those modified rifles, for the soldiers whose lives were extended by even a few weeks because they had better weapons, the modifications mattered. They mattered profoundly. They mattered enough to change lives. They mattered enough to create legacy. They mattered enough to prove that innovation, born from desperation and necessity, could occasionally bend the arc of history just slightly in a direction that favored survival over extinction. And sometimes that slight bend was everything.